Well, I think that we already see the impact of these events now unfolding in Israel on Ukraine, because first of all headlines are now suddenly dropping Ukraine and putting this conflict between Hamas and Israel on the front lines. So that is the first thing. It's the media who's shifting away from Ukraine. And that's a bad sign, I think, for the Ukrainian government, because it means that the next step is that the funds flow away. The funds now flow to Israel, basically US funds flow to Israel. And that's not that surprising because we saw that that was already a point of conflict on which the Speaker of Congress had to resign. It was about this secret or hidden deal that he would have with the Biden administration to get a separate bill on funding Ukraine, which was very much opposed by the more peace-minded people in Congress. So we see the next step flowing away of money. But the third thing is, and I read that this morning, is that there were 2,000 military advisors in Ukraine who are now all taking a plane back to Israel. So there's also an intelligence drain from Ukraine towards Israel. So there is that are a lot of things that are now impacting this situation in Ukraine. Well, what the first thing is, how long will the conflict in Israel last? And the last thing that I read was that Israel's preparing for at least a month or longer of a ground offensive in Gaza, which means that, and I think they have the abilities, they could end this within a couple of days. And obviously they want to prolong this situation. So they want to keep that longer in the news. Which means that indeed the situation will be that the United States will be longer involved in the Israel-Hamas conflict, sending there these large warships, etc., etc. So yes, then when it would end within a couple of days, nothing would change with regard to Ukraine or the bill or whatever. But since that will take longer time, then we look at the situation in the EU versus Ukraine. Yes, the EU will have to pick up the bill, but it is already doing that. What the last thing that I saw was that $200 million are found somewhere because of some accountancy mistake within the Pentagon. They suddenly found a 200 million for Ukraine, but Germany promised yesterday 1 billion for Ukraine. So they're picking up the bill. They're doing that. And well, I think that's also what they've been asked for by the Biden administration. Well, the complicated thing is that then they will have to distance themselves more from the US. But as you know, that Europe is really flooded with US military bases. It's not like, okay, we are here in Europe and we have our own army, etc., etc. No, it's like being occupied by the US militarily. There is no real independence there, so it will take a very painful process of gaining more autonomy and more distance from the US that it's either that difficult way, or we will see a strategic victory of Russia in Ukraine, and I think it's happening as we speak. They started their big offensive, and the Ukrainian defenses are crumbling. So what you will see then is a consolidation of the change in geopolitical balance of power. Before this Ukrainian conflict started, we basically lived in a unipolar world where the US was the hegemon, the power that dominated the world since basically the fall of the Soviet Union. Under the surface, Russia and China were building up massive power, and it was partially because of the fact that the EU and the US outsourced all their industry to China. I mean, they did it themselves, creating this big power in China, because it fed the Chinese with a lot of knowledge, for instance, and with a lot of production capacity. So China grew and grew and grew in economic power, and together with that they started creating military power. On the sideline, Russia was observing all these developments, creating its own strong internal economy and military. So once the conflict in Ukraine started, it became more and more apparent that we actually, at this moment, live in a multipolar world. The multipolarity is there. It's no longer a question of when will we come to some kind of a multipolar world. We live now in a multipolar world because we have this Eastern Pole, this cooperation between Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, and then a bigger cooperation in the BRICS countries, and then these 20 applicants for joining BRICS. So what we see is the global South and the East are now getting more and more and more together, having a majority of the world population, having a majority of the world economy, and having a majority of military power. So yes, there is a big shift in the balance of power which has now become apparent. Well, I think it will affect them quite heavily. So first, the Europe and the EU within this multipolar world, that multipolar world could give the EU an opportunity to become a pole in itself, but only by teaming with Russia. Without Russia, there won't be enough weight of the EU, because it's already also internally hollow. The industries are going to the United States or Bahrain or whatever, what have you. The social fabric is torn apart because of mass migration. So there is what I basically see in Europe is weakness. So it will be a minor player in this whole multipolarity. Then, looking at what's happening in these international institutions, I take, for instance, the G20. We had a G20 summit in India like a month ago. There, the United States pressed a paragraph in the final statement from the G20, which would condemn the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And it was cut out. It was not accepted by other countries in the G20 summit, which would have never occurred like 5 years ago. It would have been obvious that this statement would have been put in, because everybody would have submitted to these demands of the United States. And now they stood up and said, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to let down the country that we basically is our ally. Because that's what is behind that. They're teaming up with Russia. The majority of countries in the G20 is now in the eastern pole. That is a major shift. And so you see immediately the impact on these decision making and on these final statements. And that's just the G20. But we have the World Health Organization, we have the United Nations, we have the IMF, we have all kind of very large and powerful international institutions who will be impacted by this shift. First of all, when we look at the different countries in the EU, there is of course a difference between Eastern and Western countries. The Western ones are very close culturally at this moment to the United States, and there is no longer there a traditional Western civilization. It's perverted, it's corrupted by what I call liberalism, which is a sort of socialism, which is sort of communism or what have you. They continuously rename it, but it's basically always the same thing, which is anti-Christian, which is anti-family, which is anti-values, you might say, traditional values. So we have this perverted ideology ruling Western Europe at this moment, which, as it is ruling the United States. And then we have a traditional culture, which is still dominant in Eastern Europe, and which also has large majorities in Western Europe. And then I don't make any difference between your roots, the roots you have. Either if you have, to take the American situation, Hispanic roots, they're traditional Christians. If you have Irish roots, traditional Christians. But if you have no roots at all, and that's what they want you to have no roots. They want you to have no identity. So then you will be a formless puppet who can be manipulated by the deep state. And that is the situation that we also have here in the EU, that they try to destroy the traditional roots of the population. And that's one of the reasons why we have this mass migration. If you have mass migration from Muslim countries, I can tell you this, they're very traditional. They're absolutely not liberal. So if you got like an Islamic majority in Western Europe, it will become only more traditional instead of less. So they're making very big mistakes here. And the biggest mistake that you can make is to underestimate the importance of religion to the individual. It's where their identity was formed, was within this religion. And that is what basically the liberal atheist cannot imagine, is that this power of religion is so strong that it actually can withstand any attack from liberals. Well, what we saw in is what our perception always has been is that Russia is a communist country for like 70 years. So people are deeply communist. Well, if you look at traditional Christian values, there are a lot of similarities with some of the basic ideas of communism, like that you want to have, that you are pro the well-being of the population, which is a very nice thought, and I'm pro of that for 100%, but that doesn't make me a communist. And that's the same thing in Russia. People share these ideas, but not the totalitarian idea of this one party governing everyone, destroying family values, people spying on each other, betraying each other. That is what happened in communist Russia. They got rid of that. They got this raw capitalism, where the oligarchs basically dominated Russia. And then Putin came and he restored order, law and order. People in Russia love Putin. When you're indoctrinated by our Western media, you can't imagine that. But basically he restored order and welfare. So, and he did that together with the Russian Orthodox Church. And Putin himself is Russian Orthodox, and he's very openly about that. So what I think is that the traditional roots of Russia are Christian Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, and the Russian people still embrace Christianity to a large majority. And there are, of course, everywhere these people who are opposing everything and want to destroy everything for whatever reasons, and they are also there in Russia. But I think Russian culture and the Russian society at this moment is traditional and is to a large extent Christian.